Right, now, good afternoon, Miss Stewart.
Good afternoon, my lord. Giving evidence this afternoon is a panel of two, Dr Shannon and Miss McCann, both representing the Scottish Sensory Centre.
Very good. Good afternoon, Dr Shannon and Miss McCann. Very good. Right, when you're ready, Miss Stewart.
Thank you, my lord. Dr Shannon, can you please confirm your full name for us?
Yes, sure. It's Dr Brian Shannon.
And Miss McCann?
Mrs Elizabeth Jane McCann.
Thank you. Now, the Scottish Sensory Centre has provided a response to the inquiry's Rule 8 request. My lord, this can be found at SCI-SSC-5 zeros and a 1. This document was signed by Professor John Ravenscroft, who is the head of the Scottish Sensory Centre. But I understand that you both had input to this response, Dr Shannon, in respect of the impacts on the deaf, and Miss McCann in relation to those who are visually impaired. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yes.
In terms of your professional experience, I want to come to you first. Dr Shannon, you are a qualified teacher of the deaf, a qualified educational audiologist, and since January of this year you have been the coordinator for deaf education at the Scottish Sensory Centre.
That's correct.
Thank you. And during the pandemic, can you explain to us a bit about what your role was?
Yes. During the pandemic, I was the manager of the Service for Deaf Children in Fife, and I was also employed at the university as a placement tutor within deaf education, and I also was the course organiser and lecturer in audiology at the university.
Thank you. And I should say, my lord, the Scottish Sensory Centre is based within Murray House, which is Edinburgh University School of Education and Sport. What did your role within the university or within the Scottish Sensory Centre entail?
At the Scottish Sensory Centre, I'm involved in a variety of groups that are there to support deaf education. I also help organise courses for teachers of the deaf and other professionals working in deaf education.
Thank you. And I understand you are commissioned by the National Deaf Children's Society to undertake some research into the views and experiences of deaf children and their families using assistive devices at home before and during the pandemic. And, my lord, this research was published in 2022 and it has been disclosed to core participants and can be found at SCI-SSC-5 zeros and a 6. If I can turn to you now, Mrs McCann, you're a qualified teacher of visual impairment and you are the professional learning coordinator at the Scottish Sensory Centre, again for visual impairment, is that right?
That is correct.
And during the pandemic, can you tell us what role you had?
So I had multiple roles at that time. So I was working as a qualified teacher of visual impairment within a local authority, and I had a caseload spanning a range of ages from children in primary school, secondary and in special schools. So I did that for 2 days a week. I also worked at the Scottish Sensory Centre, and again I had a dual role there. Very similar to Dr Shannon, I was organising courses for teachers of visual impairment, so professional learning, and not just for teachers but also for a range of other professionals as well, and third sector. And I also teach on the postgraduate diploma in visual impairment. This is a mandatory qualification for teachers to gain their qualification to become qualified teachers of visual impairment.
Thank you, and that's something I wanted to come on to ask you about, was the qualifications for teachers of the visually impaired. What additional skills and qualifications do they have? Do they do the postgraduate diploma in education in the usual way and then additional training?
Yes, so they do their teacher training as per normal. They would go and work in a mainstream school, and then they would generally be appointed in the role of teacher of visual impairment, and they would come to Edinburgh University. We are the only provider of the qualification in Scotland, and they come on blocks and undertake the postgraduate diploma, which is at master's level 11. It generally takes around 2.5 to 3 years to complete.
Thank you. And do these teachers, specialist teachers, tend to be employed by a local authority or a charity, or?
They are, in the main, they are employed by a local authority, the only exception being if the teacher was working in a grant-aided school. But that's the only real exception. I should also add, just for context as well, that while I mostly teach teachers who are gaining the qualification, I also have some students who are there on a full-time basis who may undertake a course in visual impairment as part of the MSc on inclusive education.
Okay. And following qualification, are these teachers based typically within a single school, or are they peripatetic?
So it can vary. They will either be in a service, so they would be peripatetic in nature, covering really from birth up until the age of 18, and working or going into schools, visiting these learners in schools and at home, and again across all types of schools, and early years provision. Or they may be based in one school if they are employed by a grant-aided school.
Thank you. And in relation to the qualifications for the teachers of the deaf, Dr. Shannon, can you explain a little bit to us about their additional qualifications and skills?
So in many ways it follows a similar format to the one that's just been described. The primary difference is that the teachers also require to have a specific training level in British Sign Language, but it's exactly the same. They're employed by the local authority. The course is delivered at the university. I just should have added one additional point to my role during the pandemic, which just came to mind. I was also working, as well as managing the service in Fife, I ran weekly clinics at the audiology department with my colleagues from NHS Fife. So we ran joint audiology education clinics throughout the pandemic.
Thank you, that's helpful. That's something I'll come on to speak about the link between education and health in a short while. Dr. Shannon, can you explain for us just in high level terms a bit about the Scottish Sensory Centre's work, its aims and objectives?
Sure. So the Scottish Sensory Centre is there to try to promote and provide skills and training for for professionals working within the field, specifically deaf education and visual impairment. As I said, it will engage with different government organisations and bodies such as third sector organisations to try to work and promote work that will enhance the profession, as well as providing training, specific courses for professionals.
Thank you. We're interested to learn from you today about the impacts on learners who are blind and deaf as they go through their various stages of education, principally in early years and school education. Staying with you just now, Dr. Shannon, in terms of how those who are identified as being deaf are referred to the correct organisations prior to entering formal education, can you tell us a bit about how that operates?
Yes. So it's important probably to try and look at the origins of deafness for a child. So for a percentage of the children, they are born, have congenital deafness, and that deafness is permanent. It is primarily identified through the newborn hearing screening programme. For another percentage of deaf children, they will acquire permanent deafness later in life, at some point during their childhood. Those two groups of children will generally be referred by an audiology department, or in some areas by an ear, nose and throat department, to a central education system. However, there are another group of children that primarily have a temporary or transient form of deafness. It normally affects the middle ear, and it's quite commonly being referred to as glue ear. And so this condition, there's a high percentage of children, around 80, about 80% of the population will at some point suffer that glue ear, especially in the very early years. And so that is usually managed by the ear, nose and throat department, and that would generally have either a surgical procedure to remove the blockage in the ear, or have hearing aids, because it's important to put deafness as not being an inability to say to hear, but deafness is a challenge accessing communication. For some children, they need to, for some children, they will have a form of deafness, which means that they accessing a speech, even in a quiet environment, can be challenging. But for children that have got a permanent form of deafness, they find it listening in noise, accessing communication, a challenge. But we also have deaf children that require British Sign Language, because it's important to see deafness not as a medical condition, but as a sense of identity about who you are, and therefore parents, when they find out their child is deaf, need to make decisions about communication, because all children require language and communication, and it's important to state that children develop their language and communication within really the first 4 years of life. So it's not as if for a few years as happened potentially in the pandemic, where things were put on hold. The children only have a very narrow window to develop those communication skills, and families have a time to make decisions and informed choices about the communication, whether that be BSL or spoken communication.
Thank you. That provides us with helpful context when we come on to look at the impacts. Can you tell us how it is these children are made known to education services?
So for the permanent form of deaf children, they will be referred generally by an audiology department to a central education service. For the children that have got a temporary form of deafness, unfortunately there is currently within Scotland there is no national referral pathway for those children, and therefore some children will go to audiology services, and they might, depending, be referred onto a central service, but for some they might just be referred back to the local school, and for some children with glue ear, they might be managed on a wait and see basis by a GP, and so they're unknown to a whole group of people that need to have an intervention, and their language and communication will be compromised without it.
Thank you. Staying with teaching of the deaf, Dr. Shannon, it would be helpful if you could, I understand there's those who use BSL and there are those who use spoken communication. Could you provide a bit of context for us in terms of telling us how and where these two groups of children are educated by and large, those who use BSL and those who are deaf but able to speak?
So for deaf children, the vast majority of deaf children are now educated in a mainstream school. That would be true whether children are using spoken communication or British Sign Language. For a percentage of children, they will go to an enhanced provision, which would generally be a resource base for the deaf, or sometimes are called schools for the deaf. They are places normally within a mainstream school that have specific staff and acoustic conditions that will enhance their ability to access communication. So for BSL children, they would require access to a communication support worker or a support staff member that ideally should have a high level of British Sign Language skills to be able to allow them to access the communication. And for children, whether it be in a resource base or in a mainstream provision, they would require additional devices and support to make the curriculum accessible. A hearing aid has a range of about 1 to 1.5 metres. Some of them may be modern hearing aids, 2 metres. After that, you're relying on the sound reflecting in the room. So if the acoustics in the room are not good for speech, therefore they can make speech more difficult to hear, and therefore you require a device where the teacher or the person speaking would wear a transmitter that would communicate directly to a receiver that attaches either to a hearing aid, or for some children they have an implantable hearing aid called a cochlear implant, and it would communicate, and therefore by increasing what's called the ability to have direct speech being communicated to the device and therefore into the hearing mechanism, you can try to mitigate to some extent the challenges of poor acoustics or distance.
Thank you. I want to ask you in a short while about the assistive devices that are used, but before I do, just staying just now with the individual professionals who work alongside these children to provide their education. What is the role of other professionals beyond the teacher or the teacher for the deaf?
So for a deaf child to be, have a successful outcome, that range of professionals need to be involved. So at the point of finding out a child is deaf, it's unusual for somebody to be identified as deaf, and therefore the first person that would become involved would be a paediatrician. So a paediatrician would be there to do what's called etiological investigations, so an investigation into why the child is deaf. So for some families they wish to find that out. So a paediatrician would be involved. Audiology would be involved, because they are the ones that obviously do the initial assessment and will continue to check hearing levels have stayed the same and to issue any hearing aid. There would be ear, nose and throat if the child had some middle ear issue, because as I said before, it's quite common. In addition to that, there would be the need for a speech and language therapist to be involved to ensure that the language and communication is developing as it should. There would also be, for families, being able to make an informed choice, have access to a BSL tutor or the ability to learn BSL. In addition to that, there would be a teacher of the deaf would be assigned in one shape or form. For some children they require a weekly visit, for some it can be once every month, or it could be once every year. It depends on the child's needs. There would be a support staff member for when they're in school or in nursery. And then obviously there's the third sector organisations that are there to provide support to the family, such as the National Deaf Children's Society, there's the Deaf Action, British Deaf Association. So there's a wide range of people involved.
Thank you. And pre-pandemic, were those interactions done all in person within a school or early learning centre and also within the home?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to turn now to you, Ms McCannon, your area of expertise. Again, can I ask you, in connection with those children who are visually impaired, how is it that they are first of all identified and made known to education services?
So the majority of children are identified in the clinical setting, and so this would be by an ophthalmologist. We also have an organisation called VINCIP, which stands for Visual Impairment Network of Children and Young People. And VINCIP have a pathway, and so once a child is identified as having a visual impairment, and they have a set of criteria which is actually quite broad, the referral would be made to education services and also to habilitation, who deal with orientation and mobility. So that is the ability to move around safely, both in the home, the school and the wider environment as well. And there can also be referral to third sector, so to charities as well. So generally it's through health, but schools can also make referrals for children if they have a concern about their vision, but the child in the first instance, or the parents, would be expected to take their child to a high street ophthalmologist just to make sure that there's not some simple refractive error.
Okay. In terms of the education of these children, young people, I understand there are those who use Braille and those who require other adjustments. Can you tell us a bit about how and where these two groups of children, young people, are educated?
So very much like children who are deaf, children who've got a visual impairment are educated in a mainstream setting. So they would attend their local nursery, primary or secondary school. There are a small number of children who may attend a grant-aided school, for example, for visual impairment, but this vast majority are in a mainstream setting. Now, we do have in Scotland some additional resource bases. They tend to be scattered through the central belt of Scotland. So these are a resource base within a school where children who are likely to have the most significant visual impairment, so they require large print or would be Braille users. And if they lived within a local authority, that may be a choice that is made for that young person to attend a base.
In connection with the other professionals who are integral to this child's education, in addition to the teacher or the specially qualified teacher, can you tell us a bit about the other professionals you've mentioned, habitation, for example? Are there others?
Yes. So a lot of children, or many children, would also have access to a support for learning assistant. They may be either employed centrally by the local authority and only work with children who have got a visual impairment, and they would have additional skills. So, for example, they may be very good, or they may be trained in the use of Braille. We also have other people who are employed, again, maybe centrally by the local authority, as transcription, for working in transcription. And this means that they would prepare curricular materials in alternative formats. It might be Braille, it could be large print. They would make pictorial materials, they would adapt that into raised diagrams for learners who are blind or need Braille. They may convert text into electronic documents so that it could go to a young person's iPad, that they could access it that way. So we have these transcription people as well. We have also habilitation specialists who, as I mentioned previously, support with safe movement and access, and also do aspects of daily living, which can involve basic things such as dressing, using cutlery, learning how to make a hot drink safely, and so on. And also all of the health professionals that go around that as well, so ophthalmologist, orthoptist, paediatricians as well.
Thank you very much. In terms of the impacts of lockdown and other restrictions, I'm going to take visual impairment and deafness separately, and also blind deafness, to which you've dedicated a section in the Rule 8 response. Before I move on to that, I was struck, Mrs McCann, at something you said at section 7 on page 5 of your Rule 8 response. You said that as a result of online learning and the use of video games during COVID, more children are being diagnosed with difficulties due to much increased screen time. Can you explain to us how and to what extent increased screen time can impact a child's eyesight?
So the longer that you spend looking at a screen, then your eyes have to converge or turn inwards in order to be able to focus. And as adults who may have a job working on screens generally, there's quite clear health and safety advice about having a break away from screens. But this didn't happen during COVID, and as a result, that continued and repeated convergence over a long period of time has led to more children having issues with alignment, issues of the eyes, and and therefore squints and so on, and also myopia as well, so short-sightedness. So these things have been exacerbated by that additional screen time. Because of lockdown and so on, things have not been picked up, not been addressed again by clinics in the way that they would have done.
Thank you. Is this something that has impacted children's eyesight, or is it something that applies to the population at large?
So these would be children who would not have been known previously to services. So this is a new group of children, if you like, that are being identified as a result of COVID. And whether they are known to teachers of visual impairment now would depend on how the significance of that visual impairment has become, and whether it can be corrected with glasses.
Thank you. Staying with the impact on those who are visually impaired, I want to ask you some questions about the use of assistive devices and the impact of school closures and the move to online learning. At section, perhaps first of all, before we move on to that, we can look at the impact on the learners who use Braille. Can you set out for us how their learning was impacted by learning from home and doing so online?
So when we think about children who are blind learning in school, we have a model called learning to access and access to learning. And when children are young, perhaps in nursery and primary school, it's very much about access to learning. So their work is prepared for them in an alternative format. And as that learner progresses through school and as their skills develop, it changes from access to learning and learning to access. So they learn to access independently, and that can be through Braille and through assistive technology. So over time, that changes. The move to online learning had a significant impact on that, because in order to be able to access learning, your learning has to be created in a format that you can access. In school, on a day-to-day basis, for a learner who's got a significant visual impairment and is a Braille user, there's not a single piece of work that is presented to that learner that hasn't gone through some kind of process before it goes to that learner. So there will be multiple adaptations and modifications and preparation of that work in a different format. That didn't always happen during lockdown, and didn't happen for multiple reasons. In order to make that learning accessible, there's got to be close communication between the teacher of visual impairment, the class teacher, and then also the person who's going to do the transcription. Now, sometimes that can be someone who's got a dedicated role for transcription, and sometimes it can be a support for learning assistant. In some cases, the support for learning assistants who may have been working with children with visual impairment were diverted to do another job. So that, for example, could have been to work in a hub school. So the person who was doing that transcription support was taken away to do another task. For some learners, they didn't have the skills of access to learning, or may have been at the point of access to learning. And it's very difficult, challenging to teach Braille, for example, when you're doing it online. We had additional difficulties in terms of the platform that we were being asked to use. And during the initial lockdown, I was actually, or just before the lockdown, I was teaching a young person Braille in school. And when lockdown came, we were all asked to use Teams, but again, while Teams was a function, many of the aspects of that functionality were closed off. So for example, the use of the camera. So it was difficult if that young person was sitting perhaps with a parent or sibling in the house to model things such as a hand technique for moving across the line of Braille because there were no cameras. So all of those things were a barrier. Again, for other learners who are perhaps large print users, they would access their work in school using video magnifiers. And a video magnifier is a fairly large piece of equipment, particularly if you're in a primary school, because you're used to sitting in one room, in one seat for quite a lot of the time. So these are fairly large pieces of equipment, expensive pieces of equipment. And when the first lockdown happened, not all children got their equipment home with them. And that could have been for a variety of reasons. And one particular reason may be the need to transport that piece of equipment home and not having transport to take it to the home as well, or indeed room to have it at home as well. So that put learners at a disadvantage because they didn't have essential pieces of equipment that would allow them to access their work.
Thank you. I want to just go back to something you mentioned a short while ago, which was the redeployment of specialist teachers. And I noticed from your Relate response, you talk also about the furlough of certain specialists. What was the incidence of that redeployment or furloughing, and what was the impact of that?
So if I can take furloughing first of all. Furloughing, generally speaking, happened to those who were working in the third sector. And those are people who deliver habilitation, so that orientation and mobility and daily living. So these workers were furloughed, and so there was no support for habilitation. So I can speak about a student who came from China to do her full-time master's at the University of Edinburgh. And she arrived at the height of the pandemic. And she decided to take one of my courses. And I met her. So it became quite clear to me when we met at the university that her mobility skills were not as good as they might have been for someone of her age. So there was nobody around to help her in how to navigate independently and safely from her residence to, say, the supermarket down the road. Prior to her arrival, we would have previously alerted those services, and they would have come in to the halls of residence, and they would have done simple things like marking up the washing machines, the cooker, to allow her to cook independently, know when things are turned on, know what program to use on the washing machine and so on for washing her clothes. We were not able to do that. So as a result, although I'm not qualified in habilitation, I was able to go in. But I was able to do that because the University of Edinburgh has a Scottish Sensory Centre there. And I would hate to think of the impact that would have had on other students across Scotland who perhaps didn't have that, at least some kind of service. But there was no service across Scotland for anybody delivering habilitation, unless in the very slim, and there are very few of them, habilitation officers who are employed by a local authority. I can probably think of 2 in the whole of Scotland. So that was a huge issue. And again, there was no habilitation for children and young people. In terms of teachers, then and also classroom assistants, they were also being asked, or the potential to be asked to go into hub schools. So again, this made planning and teaching very difficult. Even when we were doing our best to do online teaching, the difficulty was that you could be called away at a moment's notice to support in a hub school if that was needed, which then left the teachers of visual impairment and the staff also feeling that those children with visual impairment were less important because hub schools were taking priority.
You mentioned a short while ago about the use of video magnifiers. Are there other assistive devices that are used by those who are visually impaired?
So video magnifiers are in the main used by learners who are large print users. For our learners who are Braille users, they have a Perkins Brailler, which is a bit like an old-fashioned typewriter. That's what most young people start to learn with. As learners get older, they may have Braille note-taker devices, which are small. It's like a very mini computer, which will speak and also has pins at the bottom which pop up and are your Braille cells. Also, young people have laptops with specialist programs such as speech output, and some may also have Braille displays as well. So as well as the computer talking what's on the screen, you have the text in Braille as well on the Braille display.
And were these devices available to the children who are learning online at home?
Some children may have had those, but again, it becomes very challenging to teach those devices when you aren't there in person, because you cannot see what is on the screen in front of that young person. Not all children had the we're at a kind of far enough along in that access to learning and to be able to be confident. Parents weren't confident either on how those devices worked, so it made learning of screen readers and also note takers much more challenging.
You set out in your relate response that some pupils had IT devices provided by the local authority, and you referred to the difficulty or the inability to install software or update apps. Can you explain a bit about the software and apps necessary for the learning of a visually impaired young person?
So many of our young people will have tablet devices as well, which sometimes can replace what a video magnifier does. So and will access things, but these devices are owned by the local authority, and so they are quite, for security reasons, locked down. So when it comes to updating those devices, you can't do it unless you are actually on council premises. So therefore, your device becomes out of date quite quickly, or you can't log in as well because your password has expired. So all of those things are challenges as well that prevents access.
I want to just ask you a little bit about hub schools, just as my final question in this section. Were pupils who use Braille given access to hub schools in the first lockdown?
No. As far as I'm aware, children who are Braille users did not. During the second lockdown, in some local authorities, young people who were Braille users had access, but this was not universal across Scotland.
And what about those with visual impairments who don't use Braille? Were they also given access in the second lockdown?
As far as I am aware, most children who are large print users, unless there was some other reason, didn't have access to hub schools.
Thank you. I just want to ask you to describe to us, insofar as you're able to, what the hub schooling of these pupils who did attend the hubs looked like. For example, did they have the benefit of a qualified teacher of visual impairment and the other necessary support you've outlined already?
From what I have been told, I wasn't actually in a hub school at that point during the second lockdown, and I wasn't working for a local authority, but my understanding is that teachers of visual impairment did go in into the hub schools if there was a young person there who was a Braille user, yes.
Thank you. I want to turn now to you, Dr. Shannon, to ask you very similar questions in relation to deaf learners. You set out in the relate response that at the first lockdown, not all pupils had the devices they needed to learn from home. Can you tell us a bit about the devices that deaf students, first of all the BSL users, might require to have?
So it's important to put in context that 90% plus of children that are deaf are born into hearing families. So for the BSL users, in a sense, fall into two groups. There are BSL users whose first language in the home are deaf parents that are using BSL. So in those cases, the children will be exposed to BSL and they will develop language in a similar way to a hearing child through exposure to a language. However, for deaf children that were born into a hearing family, they were at a significant disadvantage because to develop, you need to develop a language, and you develop a language through exposure. The old saying is language is caught, not taught. So you need to be able to have exposure to people that are proficient with that language. That was not happening across Scotland. So there's a limited number of skilled staff pre-pandemic, but within the pandemic situation, not all those the cameras, as we've already heard on Teams, were switched off. So you need to physically see somebody. You need somebody for family members who have got a deaf child. They need to be able to access sign tutors to develop their skills so that they can communicate with their child. It's quite an emotional range to be able to have a deaf child that you cannot communicate with, and all the support networks that you require have been removed. So, deaf children, the parents were at home trying to support their deaf children as best that they could, but without access physically to a BSL user. So in some areas they would try to source alternative, video communication systems, but the blanket switch off of the screen system basically denied deaf children their education because you couldn't access communication. For your want to talk about BSL, so I'll stop there.
So that's fine, and I understand from those who perhaps rely on lip reading, also that would have been an impact.
Correct, because communication, although we talk about BSL and spoken language, we call that multimodal communication. Namely, every language, spoken language, involves looking at people's body language, looks at lip reading, all of those different things. So we all use visual and auditory parts to communication. So a BSL user or a deaf user that's using spoken language, the switching off of a screen basically, switched off education.
You've set out in your Rule 8 that learners struggle to access laptops or computers where two-way communication was available. Is that what you mean, that there was a screen and cameras in both directions?
Correct. So in some situations, for some families where there had maybe multiple children in the family, there might have only been a single laptop. So some children were accessing their education through online learning that might have been on a phone or a tablet or a laptop or a shared device. So not only did the technology, the technology had full capacity, but significant restrictions were imposed on that functionality, and that disadvantaged children, especially with an additional support need. And deaf children, as I said, deafness is not a learning disability. Deaf children can achieve the same as hearing children if they have access to communication. What we did by removing that is we took away communication.
Okay. You say in your Rule 8 that there was limited input from teachers of the deaf, and this is something that Mrs McCann has touched on in relation to those who are visually impaired. Can you tell us a bit about why that was the case?
So again, there was a variety of reasons. Some of those were, as Mrs McCann has said, that decision makers within the local authorities were prioritising potentially support into hub schools because maybe staff members were were absent, and they were looking to source staffing for those the hubs. But in some cases, there was just a lack of priority given to deaf children. In some cases, we had unions, telling staff members not to support children online because they felt there were safety concerns. But again, there was all these competing interests were happening. But at the heart of this was a deaf child, and as I said, you can't. If what is happening is occurring during the time when your window of opportunity to develop a language is happening, to remove that, you're taking away somebody's right to a language, to communication, to participation, and it has a lifelong effect. You can't come back after a year or two and say, well, pick up your language. That a human being has that window of opportunity.
Thank you. You mentioned in your Rule 8 response, and indeed the parents you surveyed say that there was ineffective classroom management, and this was a barrier, and this brings us back to the helpful explanation you gave us before about the impact of noise coming from more than one source. Can you explain a bit to us about how the classroom management was ineffective?
Yeah. So, in an ideal situation, a deaf student would have their assistive device, which they would be able to attach to a laptop, which would then mean that the what was being transmitted from the laptop would go straight into the receiver of the hearing aid, and therefore into the hearing mechanism. As I've described, those systems were not routinely available. You then had an online learning platform, because as I said, in many cases there was no access to a visual reinforcement. So you were then having somebody, the class teacher, on an online list, having, not muting all the microphones, for instance, on the computer, and so it's understandable. People were in busy households, and so sometimes you had televisions on or other things going on with the family, which was then, polluting the learning environment. You then also had in a classroom, you would generally not expect to see everyone just shouting out the answers, but there wasn't. There's a hand up option on Teams that wasn't always being utilised. So really, for a lot of parents, and certainly in the research we carried out, parents were saying, basically the kids were just becoming deflated and disengaged because this was not a learning environment that was accessible to them, and so the pandemic, in a sense, amplified already issues around how deaf children access mainstream provision. I think it's important that policymakers have a greater understanding of the needs of deaf children, so that those were not firmly established, because if they were, then the online learning would have been more managed, more organised. But mainstream teachers were thrown into suddenly learning online, so they were learning technology that had been restricted, and there was no real communication with professionals in the field to say, we're doing this, is there a way that we can make this better, or we can mitigate the effects?
In terms of the assistive devices, you've explained very powerfully for us that the absence of the face-to-face with the speaker or the speakers is important, but had that not been the case, did the child have access to the device needed to amplify the sound, for example?
No. So in a sense, if we think about hearing devices for deaf children that use them, there's either a hearing aid or a cochlear implant, and then, like I said, there's an assistive device that attaches a receiver to that and a microphone. So for the hearing device, the hearing aid to work, you need to have ear molds that are properly fitted. Because of the pandemic, there was a delay for some children being able to get access to new ear molds. A lot of the health boards were going to scanned molds that had been taken previously, and the manufacturers were adding on a millimetre ear across the board to try to get a mold that fitted. So in some cases the children's hearing devices were not working at an optimal level. Then on top of that, lots of services, the equipment is expensive, there is no doubt about that. However, that was not routinely made available to families. Equally, when there were problems, because you were a family being given a device, how do you connect this up, how does it all work? The support network around that was not always available. So, you know, it was a lack of access to universal devices, a lack of access to the hardware laptops, and also, you know, making sure that the equipment the deaf children required to access the curriculum that was suitably maintained.
In terms of access to hub schools, were those who are users of BSL given access to hub schools in the first lockdown, or indeed the second?
So in the first lockdown, there was no deaf children that I was aware of that were accessing the hub schools. In the second lockdown, some deaf children did access those schools, but again, it was not universal across the country. Certainly for BSL users, there would be a strong case to be made that they required that physical person to be there to communicate with them.
And in connection with those who communicate with the spoken word, were they given access in the second lockdown?
Again, this was not always universal, and again it comes back to this lack of understanding. There's a conceptual understanding that a deaf child, if you provide them with a hearing aid, that suddenly they become an honorary hearing person. They can hear and participate in society. That is not the case. A device is only as effective as the environment that it's in and the other equipment that is attached to it, and therefore making the case that deaf children required communication. They needed to learn and develop their language, and therefore were valid candidates for a hub, was not universally applied across the country.
Thank you. And if you are able, can you tell us a bit about what the hub schooling of these children looked like when they did attend the hubs?
So I can only speak from the area that I worked in at the time, that we would send teachers of the deaf or support staff to the hub to support the young people. The hubs generally had a group of priority candidates, so it were children of parents that were working in the emergency services or core services. There were children whose needs were identified as being specific, but they were always trying to maintain a manageable number within the hubs. So again, it comes down to that case being made on a case-by-case basis, and it depended on different education managers within authorities. Generally, education managers will oversee an area of a region, and so it depended upon were those education managers mindful to accept the case being made.
And was the case made by the teaching staff or by the parent to the local authority?
Our authority was generally made by either the staff, teachers of the deaf approaching myself, or myself approaching the different education managers and making that case.
Thank you very much. I want to look now at another cohort, and that is those who are deaf-blind. And if I can bring you in on this, Mrs. McCann. It's set out at page 6 at section 7b that online learning does not meet the needs of these children and young people, and you speak about a multi-sensory approach being required. Can you explain to us what's meant, first of all, by a multi-sensory approach?
So I think if I talk just very briefly, first of all, about deaf-blind. So these are our children who've got a dual sensory impairment, But most of those learners that we find in Scotland, but perhaps not exclusively, do have additional support needs above and beyond having a hearing loss and a visual loss. So many of those young people would be found in special schools. So those young people had more access to learning during that time, but obviously if there were significant health concerns, then some parents may have taken the option not to send them to school because of the fragility of their health. Nonetheless, they are still entitled to education. But a multisensory approach to learning is exactly that. They need to have literacy, for example, through sensory storytelling that use simple language, but also have props and real objects which will have a variety of touch and smell and perhaps taste as well, that will enhance learning and be able to help them to understand concepts more readily.
It is a multisensory approach to learning about the environment in which the child is, or is it more about the pedagogy deployed by the teacher?
It's both, because as I've just really described the pedagogy, for those learners, they need to have an environment where there are few other distractions, because that can interfere with learning. So they want a low arousal environment where it is quiet, that allows them to focus on the language that is being used, and where there are a few distractions. For example, people moving around will be a distraction away from the learning, which will take their attention away, because they sometimes their hearing, if their vision is quite low, then they may have a hearing loss, but actually their hearing is a better sense, so they will tune into that and they will use that very well. But for those children, anybody moving around will be a distraction. Also, very bright rooms, light is also positioning of that young person within the room is really important, because often, again, they can stare at light and not actually take their visual attention onto the thing that they're being presented with.
Is it, in your view, Mrs. McCann, possible to have this multisensory education within a domestic setting?
It's very, very challenging. In a home setting where everybody was at home, everybody, for some families, their accommodation wasn't always ideal, so everybody was in the same room or in a couple of rooms. Again, as Dr. Shannon has explained about competing background information, and also something that I haven't mentioned, and I probably should have mentioned in my last question that you asked. There's been a lot of talk and discussion about the amount of input that the parents need to have, or that another person needs to have with that child, whether they have a visual impairment or are deaf-blind. And for some families, if there are a lot of children at home, trying to divide and split up your attention is really difficult. It's also really difficult in families where both parents worked, because they were juggling two jobs, each having a job, where they were having online meetings, and so it was very, very difficult. That when did you squeeze in? Education had to be almost fitted around the needs of the parents first, because they had to keep hold of their job in order to have a family and a roof over their head. So that was another huge issue. But there were lots and lots of barriers, particularly for the learners who required that multisensory approach, because education for them, it's very difficult to squeeze in lessons that last an hour, because their attention and their level of fatigue is such that it needs to be short bursts throughout the day, and that's another additional challenge.
Thank you. One thing I did want to ask you about, I'm not sure who's best placed to respond to this, is about the assistive devices used by those who are deaf-blind, and in particular the switches that they use You've set out that not all students had access to switches when they were at home, that sharing of switches was an issue. I don't know which one of you is best placed to speak to that.
I'm happy, yep.
Please carry on.
Yes, so for many children who are deafblind, they don't have speech, and so they may access switches, and they would have been assessed by, it might have been an occupational therapist in terms of where is the best position for that switch to be in, to allow them to physically move either an arm or a head or a leg in order to access that switch. And there are a variety of switches that are on the market, and switches that have require minimal movement for a young person that's got quite restricted both gross motor and fine motor skills. So these are the kind of switches that you might just put your hand on, and a slight finger movement would trigger the switch. Or to other switches which are larger, as I say, that can be accessed by hitting it. So again, in a classroom situation, those switches may be shared by a number of learners, and indeed, for example, in a morning routine for saying good morning to their classmates, that might be something that would be passed around a group of young people. But again, when learning moved to online learning and young people weren't accessing school, they didn't always have access to any switch, never mind one that was the most appropriate for them.
Could I make just one point? It would be important also within the group that are deaf-blind. For some, they can be, say, born deaf, but they develop Usher syndrome, which is where your sight becomes much narrower to the point of not being able to see at a later point, so they can become visually impaired, you know, into their early teens. So for that group of children, especially for BSL users, they move from being able to use BSL communication to one where their world starts, and therefore their communication is removed, and therefore they need to move to a kind of on-body signing system. So there needs to be a transition from one type of communication to another, as well as the impact being, you know, in your early teens, discovering that you're going to begin to lose your eyesight and all the implications there, and the need for all those support services to be in place, and that absolutely has to happen in person. And you know, you can't learn these things online. So it's just to kind of put in context that for some, the ones that we've been talking about where deaf blindness was at birth and there's maybe more complex needs, but there are other deaf-blind individuals that, you know, whose communication and learning has followed a traditional path other than, you know, being deaf or visually impaired, and they happen not in sync, and therefore there's a process. So within that group also just needs to be considered.
Thank you. In terms of these children's access to hub schools, I understand from your ruling that there may be, for those who are born deaf-blind, certainly some additional health needs that perhaps would make hub schooling not an attractive option. But were these children offered hub school places in the first lockdown or the second?
So my understanding is that that children who had more complex additional support needs, including deaf-blindness, were offered some of them were offered hub places in the first lockdown and during the second lockdown as well.
Thank you. And again, you mentioned that they typically attend special schools. Would their schooling replicate that which they would have had pre-pandemic?
For some, there were some issues in terms of many of these young people are transported to school by taxi, which is paid for by a local authority. Again, as far as I'm aware, there were some issues around transport for those young people, and again, if they were sharing taxis and the availability of taxis to take young people to school, so sometimes that burden fell on parents as well. So there were issues, and again also around issues with staffing as well in those schools as well, and staff who themselves were vulnerable and therefore couldn't work in a hub school. So all of those had an impact on learning.
Thank you. I want to move now on to looking at the reopening of schools and operating within the restrictions, and if I can come to you first on this, Dr. Shannon, at section 8E, you say, when schools reopened, family and anxiety issues meant some deaf learners remained at home. Can you tell us a bit about what it was that led to these deaf learners not returning to school?
So this was certainly an experience that I witnessed in Fife, where there were a number of deaf learners that had been very confident members attending school, great attendance, good attainment, and they just could not leave the house. They could not go into mainstream schools. For some, they would come on a kind of a restricted timetable to try to reintegrate them back into school. And for others, they would maybe stay within a room within the school and not be able to feel confident enough to go into the classroom. I was shocked by the number of children that I had. I'd known most of these children since they were born, and to see the impact on them and their families were certainly really worried about that and their children's future.
You raise the issue of bubbles as being one aspect of the restrictions that impacted deaf pupils insofar as it impacted the level of professional input that they might have. Can you expand on that a little for us?
So within a school, within a primary school, the nursery could be classed as one bubble. The early years part of the school, primary 1, 2, 3, could be classed as another bubble, and then the senior school could be another bubble. So if you had a deaf student in each of those provisions, you weren't able to go and visit all of those because you would be crossing bubbles. So you were basically only able to go and see. You were restricted to a limited number of schools per day, but you were also limited to the number of bubbles that you could go and see. And therefore, as I said, going back to the previous point about, if you don't have the equipment, if there's a problem with your piece of equipment, then you're not able to access the curriculum. But there was no, that kind of flexibility to move between the bubbles just was not within any of the regulations.
Thank you. And Mrs. McCann, you raised similar issues in connection with the bubbles. Is that for the same reasons as outlined by Dr. Shannon?
Yes, and also if you have a child, a young person in a classroom who perhaps already has a support for learning assistant, you weren't able to go in as well as an additional adult into a room, and then the opportunity for withdrawal, which is perhaps not, would be our normal way of working. We'd rather be in the classroom to see what's happening. Every available space was taken up, so there was no opportunity for withdrawal either. But yes, exactly as Dr. Shannon mentioned, I think there was also another issue as well, particularly between at the end of the first lockdown, for learners who are transitioning as well. So for transition for a young person who's got a visual impairment requires a lot of thought, especially if they're moving between schools from nursery, primary to secondary, and also secondary out of education. But if we think about between stages, A lot of work, again, is done by habilitation specialists in order to familiarise that young person with the new environment that they are going into. But obviously these people had been furloughed, and so when schools were going to open up again in the August, at the end of that first lockdown, there was a lot of scrabbling around happening in order to get people back into work and see which children were going to be transitioning and make all of the arrangements to get access to the schools, which prior to COVID and now as well, a lot of that work would happen during the holidays because habilitation specialists don't have teachers' holidays. But they had all been furloughed. So there was a lot of work that had to be done in a very short space of time when teachers ostensibly were on holiday. So that liaison and that was just missing.
Okay. One thing I wanted to ask you about, in addition to what you've said there, is the functional visual assessments. And you say it was difficult to undertake many aspects of such assessments. Can you tell us what these assessments are and how and why they're conducted?
So generally speaking, a teacher with visual impairment would carry out functional vision assessment within the school environment to find out how well that young person is using their vision. And from the results of that assessment, generally speaking, distance assessment, testing of near vision as well, colour, contrast and so on, we then make recommendations to the class teacher in terms of where that young person should sit in class to make maximum use of their vision. We would give advice on teaching strategies as well, and also on how their work should be prepared for them. For example, font size, font type, line spacing, all those sorts of things. In order to carry out a lot of those assessments, we need to be sitting close to that young person, and there's an exchange of material. And during the pandemic, of course, there was great concern about materials being passed between people as well, touching things, being and most services have a limited number of tests because these tests are expensive. So generally speaking, those tests go out, they're used in a school, they come back and they're passed on to the next teacher. So during the pandemic, that wasn't allowed to happen, and so there was periods of time where tests were unavailable as well. So that limited the ability of teachers with visual impairment to actually carry out a functional vision assessment. They were not happening in the clinic setting either, and a lot of more clinical assessments, which are not the same, I've got to stress, as a functional vision assessment carried out by a teacher in a school, weren't happening either. So we weren't really getting good clinical information or able to get that information in a functional sense either.
What was the impact on the learner of not having that functional assessment?
So if you don't have good data to work from, then you are not really able to give good advice to teachers. And again, you're very much relying on the learner themselves saying, well, this is if they've got their text on an iPad or on a computer, this is the text that I'm using, or this is the size that I'm using. But we don't have good data, so we're therefore unable to make the best advice, and so learning is not optimised for that pupil.
Okay. Just one final question for you, Mrs. McCann, in connection with this aspect. You mentioned that on the return to school, poor skills, both in use of technology and in braille reading technique, had to be unpicked and re-taught. Why was this? Why had pupils picked up these poor techniques?
So there are a variety of reasons. Again, the challenge of doing braille lessons remotely, when there wasn't someone who knew braille sitting beside that young person, that was a difficulty and a challenge. And sometimes learners didn't have braille, so if they were using hard braille to read rather than using a Braille device. They may perhaps didn't have as much hard Braille as they normally did, because the people who were doing the transcription when lockdown came didn't take home embossers. Very large pieces of equipment. At the first lockdown, nobody knew how long this was going to start. Thought it might be a week, maybe a fortnight, and so they didn't have that equipment at home. And again, it needs a car or someone's strength to carry it. They're bulky, they're heavy pieces of equipment. And many embossers also have acoustic hoods. If you do transcription and you're at home and you've got family, you do not want to have an embosser running in your house. It's very, very noisy. And an acoustic hood is very large as well. So a lot of young people didn't have hard Braille, and as a result, they used the things that were there in front of them. And so that would be a mobile phone, because they'd learned that they could listen. And it's often something that's mentioned by people who don't really understand literacy for children and young people, and indeed adults who are blind, that listening does not replace literacy, because you do not know how to spell a word, you don't understand about layout on a page, and so on. So listening alone is second rate, it's not literacy. But many young people had used listening alone as a way of accessing their learning in order to keep up with their sighted peers. It was the quick fix, if you like, when nothing else was available to them. And then for some learners who did have their devices, had learned to do things, if they were further down that road of learning to access. Some of them learned by trial and error on how what their devices could do for them. But this then had subsequent issues. So, for example, I heard of one learner who was using their Braille note taker and was accessing their work quite well, because work was either emailed to them or and they could open the file and access it, email it back to their teacher, and so on. That had become their normal way of working. Now, on a note taker, you would access a Word document, because that's the document or the format that's most readily accessible. You can have speech, you can have Braille, you can edit it, and so on. When that young person then returned to school and they were still using that way of working, it had become their normal way of working. However, unfortunately, due to the security of our exam system, they were not able to access the exam papers in Word format. And so there was a lot of negotiation had to take place between the teacher of VI, the local authority, and SQA in order to have their paper in a format that they could access that was still their normal way of working, because what they were doing was not something that had previously been allowed due to exam security.
Thank you, and you've answered what would have been my next question about SQA. Yeah. And on attainment, Dr. Shannon, you've set out at section 8H, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but just to tell you that the inquiry has the BATOD survey, which you refer to, about the potentially widening attainment gap due to lack of specialist support. And I understand from that it was a lack of specialist support during the pandemic, but I won't ask you further on that because I'm mindful just of my time. Just before we close, I wanted to ask both of you, perhaps Dr. Shannon first of all, were the impacts you've described both in the Rule 8 and here for us today, did you make representations to the Scottish Government to make them aware of these impacts, either at the time or subsequently?
At the time, there was no direct method that I had to make them aware of these issues, for sure. And subsequently, obviously, we've carried out the research that's already been submitted, which sets out many of these issues, and obviously in the submission here, obviously part of that, the inquiry is to highlight these, so the submissions that we've made today and also in the relate addresses those issues.
Yes, thanks very much. And Mrs. McCann, is that a similar situation for you in the role that you had at the time of the pandemic?
Yes, although I think it's also fair to say that Scottish Sensory Centre is funded by Scottish Government, and we do provide annual reports for them. So they were aware, or should have been aware through that report, of the work that Scottish Sensory Centre was doing in terms of trying our best to support teachers of visual impairment and indeed teachers of the deaf in order to deliver as good a service as they possibly could.
Thank you very much. Just in closing, I wanted to ask you both whether, in addition to what you've said today, and indeed Dr. Shannon, you've set out in the research paper we've referred to recommendations to benefit deaf learners and mitigate some of the negative impacts. But further to that, are there any other key lessons that Scottish Sensory Centre thinks should be applied to ensure these impacts are addressed and mitigated?
I think the pandemic amplified issues that were already there around the inclusion of deaf children in education. So there has been a general move towards a generic approach to provision. So almost thinking that rather than having bespoke support, the move should be towards that kind of generic provision. That the pandemic highlighted the failings of such an approach. Switching off cameras, the lack of understanding that deafness is not about an inability to hear, it's about access to communication. It's about making sure that school buildings are accessible by making sure that we have good acoustics, that we have assistive technology within integrated into school buildings. So, I think in conception, in design and implementation, there needs to be a recalibration of the support that deaf children require, so that whenever another crisis occurs, there is better understanding of the needs of deaf children, so that when the policy makers are making difficult decisions, they're being mindful that, as I said, deaf children cannot get those years back if it happens in the first 4 or 5 years of life. If you're a parent that's had a newly identified baby, then the ability to attend groups where you can meet other parents of deaf children and interact and allow your children to communicate. We are, from the clinics that I attended, the number of children that are coming through with communication difficulties. Communication difficulties primarily because, like I said, language is not taught, the ability to interact. All of this, the ability to make sure that there's when managing what was clearly a crisis, that we have realised that we're not creating future crises going forward.
And Mrs. McCann, do you have anything to add to that from the perspective of those who are visually impaired and their teachers and learners?
Yes, I think we know that visual impairment is a low incidence disability. There are, the numbers are small. But I think, again, and it is similar to what Dr. Shannon was saying, because our numbers are small, we almost completely fell off the radar, and there wasn't enough consideration given. And a similar point, this move towards generic support for learning is not good. The move away from having managers who are not qualified in visual impairment, in order for that voice to be amplified, in higher managerial structures within local authorities, is really important. And we're not seeing that now, that there's not the teachers of visual impairment often don't have a manager who's qualified in any form of sensory impairment, and being able to take that message and having it heard up the tree is really, really important. And I think as well, it's also highlighted that need for really specialist pieces of equipment, and sadly, what I hear now is that because of shortage of money, that young people are not getting that equipment. If we were to have a lockdown tomorrow, would we be in a better place, or would we actually be worse? And I think that is also something that has to be kept in mind, that access to equipment and technology for learners with visual impairment is really so important, because with the right access, whether that be through technology, through support from the right people with the right qualifications, children who've got visual impairment can learn and be successful learners, and equally as successful as their sighted peers.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you also, Dr. Shannon. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for the witnesses.
Thank you very much. Ms Stewart. Yes, and thank you, Dr. Shannon and Mrs McCann. I'm very grateful for your evidence. And that brings proceedings for today to an end, and I think we're later tomorrow morning, aren't we? It's 11 o'clock or something like that. Is that right? Yes, I'm getting nods, so it's 11 o'clock
11:15.
11:15, I do beg your pardon. Very good. That's all, thank you.
All rise.